Patrick is the CEO and co-founder of Stripe, which provides the economic infrastructure for much of the internet. Patrick actually founded Stripe with his brother John in 2010 when they found how hard it was to actually start businesses on the internet. Stripe has grown to become the most valuable fintech in the world, so it was valued at $22.5 billion in January this year. It provides internet services to millions of businesses around the world, and in fact, it provides services to 80% of adult Americans. So I'm guessing everyone here is transacted on Stripe probably, hundreds, if not thousands of times. You may not realize it because it sits behind, it's kind of discreetly behind a lot of businesses. Patrick's also a serial entrepreneur in the sense that he founded Auxomatic and sold that for $5 million in 2010. Patrick is originally, as you'll hear in a minute, is from Tipperary in Ireland, but now lives in San Francisco where Stripe is headquartered. So I wanted to start by asking Patrick that kind of embarrassing initial question, which is, how did he go from being a teenager growing up in Tipperary in Ireland to founding what's now co-founding the world's most valuable fintech startup before the age of 30 as well, just to get that in?
I'm a big beneficiary of the American openness to immigration and sort of ladder of opportunity. I came out to the US for college when I was 17. Sort of soon after coming out here, discovered that, in fact, my first time ever coming to the U.S. Was to attend a conference here at Stanford in 2005. I was 16, it was one of my, it was, I think, my first time being outside of Europe. It was certainly my first time in the U.S. It was my first time at a non-Irish college. I remember walking around Stanford and thinking, man, if every college in the U.S. is like this, the U.S. must be an amazing place. As it turns out, Stanford is sort of not quite representative of every college, but it was actually Stanford that inspired me. And sorry, this is not pre-planned. This is not content marketing for Stanford. This is just literally the truth. But
we'll take it though. Thank you.
Right. Walking around Stanford, I'm like, man, college in the U.S. Seems like quite a spectacular thing. And so that's when I decided to apply to college in the U.S. However, I guess the wrinkle in the story is Stanford rejected me. So I went to MIT look, I also dropped out. Stanford was evidently right, so I went to MIT, but then I discovered Silicon Valley, and I'd spent a lot of time programming in my youth, there were all these people starting all these kind of amazing businesses and ventures, so then when my brother started college at this, I'd kind of radicalized him at this point, such that he also came out to the U.S. He got into Stanford, not that I'm bitter, but anyway. We then decided to start Stripe together, and really went from there. But I think that the kind of high level, how did it all happen? I mean, I think it's less a story about us and more a story about sort of the U.S. and in particular Silicon Valley, and just kind of what a weird and sort of unusual and kind of fantastic ecosystem and environment it is.
There's a point you missed out that's kind of interesting here, which is Patrick actually dropped out. Maybe you mentioned actually dropped out of MIT. Now, I kind of have mixed feelings. As economists, you see in the data that one of the biggest predictors of life-run earnings, but also other things like life expectancy, marriage outcomes, et cetera, is education. So the returns to education are something like 10 to 15% a year. On the other hand, we all know about famous dropouts, I guess. Patrick, Bill Gates in the US, and my favorite is maybe Mick Jagger in the UK. Bill Gates might be richer, but I think Mick Jagger can dance better than Bill Gates. There's many Stanford undergrads here, and I teach obviously a lot of undergrads, and they often talk about dropping out, and I'm sure that many people here are parents of undergrads. I'd like to kind of get Patrick's thoughts on whether that was a good idea or a bad idea for him and for others.
Well, that's not a loaded question at all, but actually, hands up, is anyone familiar with Brian Kaplan's recent writing on sort of signaling theories in education and all of that? No? Okay, great. so in that case, it's worth checking out. And so obviously, kind of as Nick says, the correlations with having gone to college and indeed having more education and so on, sort of all those correlations sort of tend to be quite positive and quite strong. Obviously, the relevant question, though, for for us or any of us as individuals kind of planning our lives or giving advice to others is, how large is the kind of causal effect of going to college? And there, you kind of really have to look at sort of selection effects and, all the rest. There's kind of work about sort of people who go to UPenn versus Penn State. I mean, obviously, because the kind of selectivity of those institutions, kind of different kinds of people tend to go. If you sort of control for selection effects and try to kind of, look at sort of the same person who might go to either college, look at sort of long-term outcomes, it looks like the kind of ostensible effect of going to UPenn over Penn State, a lot of that really reduces. A lot of it's just in the selection effect. But furthermore, even if it's not just selection effect, then obviously you have the question of, well, how much, what is the actual treatment effect of having gone to college? And, it was the Dilbert creator, or whatever is Scott
Adams.
Adams, yes, thank you. He used to talk about how sort of if you go to HBS, kind of how much, and I guess we can talk about, it's safe to talk about HBS, not GSB. GSB is amazing, but HBS, so much of the effect of HBS is obviously, you kind of reach you reap the causal benefit just by virtue, in the first week, just because you can now say you went to HBS. And it's kind of, really questionable sort of how much is actually in the classes themselves. Sure enough, when you look into the data, i.e. the signaling effect, much of this kind of seems to be manifest. And so, for example, while it's certainly the case that college graduates seem to do better than people who, don't go to college, you would expect if there's kind of, if the explanation for that is that people learn a whole bunch of stuff that makes them better in the world, then you would expect to see that the more people go to college, the better they do, even kind of short of graduation, right? People who go for 3 years should do better than people who go for 2 years and 1 year and so on. There should be like a treatment, dose response. When you look at that, there is not really much of a sort of dose response to the treatment of going to college. Much more of it seems to be in the signal itself. And so, Brian Kaplan, who I just mentioned, he always kind of makes the point that, like, if the kind of pedagogical asset being sold by colleges, like the actual pedagogy was so valuable, wouldn't you expect to see turnstiles at the classrooms rather than at the gym? Anyway, I'm not going to kind of rehash his whole argument. Again, he wrote a whole book about this recently called The Case Against Education, which I think is a little bit overstated sort of deliberately, but kind of really diving into this kind of signaling model. My own thoughts, I think that well, even if a lot of its signals are still very valuable. I guess you still should go to college. And I think as a cop-out answer, I think it all depends on the individual.
Okay, so coming back to you as an individual, I guess for you, you got to the point where the business was taking off, and I mean, we should maybe focus on you. Why did you drop out?
Well, okay, so unstated in the introduction here was you're actually listening to two of I think two of the foremost pessimists in the country. In that Nick wrote, in my opinion, one of the most important papers in econ in the last decade or so, or co-wrote with a couple other folks, including a number here at Stanford, a paper entitled "Are Ideas Getting Harder to Find?" And basically showing how the returns to R&D spending and more broadly kind of R&D investment across a whole bunch of sectors are not only declining, but are declining exponentially. And part of what I find striking about that paper is, it's very robust. Nick wrote it. It's a really well done paper. But that sort of since it came out, the implications of that, if true, are enormous, right? Like, again, the returns to our R&D are not just declining, but declining exponentially. But what I found kind of so striking in the aftermath of this paper, and I guess the first preprint came out, I don't know, in 2017, 2016, something like that. Yeah, so it's been out for a couple of years now, is that the response from the world has not been this, profound offense and kind of attempted repudiation. No one's really taking issue with it. at least in any kind of fundamental way. But at the same time, we're not we're not in the depths of despair over it. And I think we kind of have to be in one of those two situations. We either have to think it's ludicrous and obviously wrong, or we should be incredibly depressed about it because of what it suggests about the future is super pessimistic. I said you were listening to two huge pessimists. I myself believe that. Well, as far as I can tell, it's true. I don't know if it's kind of necessarily true. Maybe we can fix it. I think it's true. But kind of furthermore, that the phenomenon that Nick's talking about is true not just in say corporate R&D or some of the kind of specific sectors that they analyzed, but that it's also true in science research. And a friend and I, we actually wrote a piece in The Atlantic back last year about this. The kind of very short summary is that we're investing kind of exponentially more in kind of basic research, or have come to invest exponentially more over the last kind of 60, 70 years or so. But by every kind of outcome measure, we appear to be getting sort of a roughly constant level of output. So exponentially increasing input, constant output, kind of again in basic research, exponentially diminishing returns. So you're wondering why you're hearing all of this. Well, you asked why did I drop out of college. I went to college sort of with the dream of becoming a physicist, and I saw these amazing people several decades ahead of me who were, in my opinion, way smarter than I was, but kind of really struggling to kind of generate the kinds of insights and discoveries and leaps that people in kind of preceding decades had. And so I thought, man, if these like phenomenal people can't make these breakthroughs, what chance do I have? Seriously. And so I decided to go do something else.
Okay. That's a very frank answer. Yeah, I mean, I think it's an important. I get asked this quite regularly by undergrads. I mean, generally stay in college, but unless in your case, I think the opportunities were so huge at the time that it made sense to drop out and go full time to your business.
Yeah, I mean, I think. Well, nobody came here. So you're.
Oh, okay, sure.
Planning R&D productivity and microphones, but yeah, I guess no one came here, looking for advice. But I guess my my instinct is that the sort of the clustering and kind of just herd effects that kind of most people follow are they kind of heed them too much. And the kind of piece of advice I try to give younger folks, I don't think it's possible to say any specific person should, without really knowing them, should do X or Y or Z. But I guess the general thing I believe is that if you are doing something that most people think is like a sensible thing to do, and the right thing to do, a prestigious thing to do, and all the rest, maybe that means you're simply weighting prestige too much. And you should kind of be thinking more from first principles, what's the best thing to do. When you think about it, in the scheme of, all things somebody could do in the world, that's a large possibility set. And so the possibility that out of everything in the world you could be doing, that you should be doing kind of exactly the same thing structurally that kind of everyone else in your cohort is doing, that just seems, a priori sort of improbable. And so I guess I would just kind of, I would kind of structurally argue for, more dispersion, more variance.
Another question is, you were in Ireland last week, and I think you announced that Stripe was looking to double its presence in Ireland, and I guess reflects on the positive business and entrepreneurship nature of Ireland. I wondered, I saw there was an article last week in the Wall Street Journal talking a bit about fears of Silicon Valley being rivaled by New York or by Beijing. What your thoughts are on the business climate in Ireland, and particularly actually in the US and Silicon Valley, and any policy that you think that, given that SIEPR is very much involved in policy, what could local policymakers be doing?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say the technology scene globally is sort of rapidly improving, and much of what has been possible in Silicon Valley, or kind of uniquely possible in Silicon Valley for many decades, is now sort of much more prevalent in far more parts of the world. China is catching up to / passing the US in sort of technology VC investment. More broadly across Europe, where the kind of technology startup scene was quite desultory back, say, 10 years ago. Now it's kind of really pretty vibrant. In addition to being in Ireland, I was, for example, in Estonia. Tallinn is a population of, I think, 400,000. And in Tallinn, Estonia, not kind of historically viewed as a super successful sort of startup nexus. You actually have sort of several multi-billion-dollar technology firms being kind of successfully run out of there. So I think the kind of the general diffusion, and this is a great story for the world because we get to reap the benefits of the stuff done elsewhere, like it's a kind of aggregate waterline. But I think the sort of general dissemination of the kinds of knowledge and practices and technologies and all the rest that we've historically had access to here in Silicon Valley, that's diffusing globally. That's a great story, and Ireland is certainly kind of included in that, which Stripe is as you say investing there. Having said that, I think while part of the story is this kind of knowledge diffusion, management practice diffusion, and all the rest, a large part of the story is, of course, one of the sort of greatest acts of, in my opinion, sort of economic self-sabotage ever engaged in by any country or region, which is playing out presently in Silicon Valley because of the chronic under-provision and undersupply of housing here. And that effectively, and of course no single policymaker thinks about it this way or has thought about it this way, but the kind of just ex post outcome is that we have chosen in aggregate an emergent outcome to to cap and to asphyxiate the improbable fountain of productivity and creativity that has been so defining of the region for the last 40 years. We see this obviously in these sort of insanely rapidly rising housing costs. We see it in basically, while kind of the Bay Area and California tend to be sort of quite pro, immigration places. We believe in sort of welcoming people from other kind of cultures and countries and all the rest. We recognize the benefits that immigrants have brought. We have kind of simultaneously chosen to erect these sort of enormously high and prohibitive immigration barriers to our region in the form of these insanely high housing costs and kind of barriers to mobility. That is restricting the growth of existing firms, indeed some of the most productive firms in the country and the world. More importantly, in my opinion, it's inhibiting the creation of new firms. Silicon Valley is just a less viable and sort of survivable region for the kind of nascent new firms that are sort of struggling to get off the ground. Google can afford to pay people all these enormous wages, but some new venture can't. And we're also, of course, disproportionately hurting those who are kind of seeking opportunity rather than those who've kind of already benefited from it. And so kind of lower income groups or again those who are sort of attempting to gain access to the opportunities of technology rather than those who are sort of already over the moat are increasingly excluded. This is for a long time, or at least for the last kind of 5 to 10 years, people have been kind of talking about this as kind of a possible inhibitory and kind of suppressing force for the aggregate productive region here. But we're now kind of very clearly seeing it in the data, where if you go talk to any kind of seed investor or accelerator or whatever, they will tell you that companies are increasingly choosing not to locate here. If you talk to any of the larger, more successful firms, Apple, Google, all the rest, they will tell you they're increasingly locating their kind of net new headcount outside of the Bay Area. And I really think this is, this affects Stripe, but whatever, we can handle it. We can put people elsewhere and so on. But I think just for kind of an aggregate story for all of us, I really think this is quite tragic because, as many people here are familiar with, there's all this kind of literature about, the returns to agglomeration, endogenous growth theory, why it's good for sort of really productive people to be together. If we believe that, and nobody here is, I think, really disputing that literature, then the value of having this kind of super concentrated place of, highly creative, productive people, that's an amazing thing for the world. And obviously the kind of the returns from Silicon Valley for the world over the past 50 years really have been quite immense. And so I think our collective choice to cap and I think to kind of ultimately shift that curve in the direction of ultimate decline is a mistaken one. And I really hope we can do something about it.
And there's something about it relaxing planning constraints.
When I said you have two of America's main pessimists in front of you, I wasn't even thinking of that point. So, God, I'm sorry to start the day on such a light note. But all right, there is something being done about it. I read last night that apparently 400 housing bills have been introduced to the Sacramento, the state legislature, this legislative session. One of those bills is a bill called SB 50, which would substantially rezone California's kind of densest urban centers, in particular places that are within half a mile of a mass transit stop. These are the places where we should support greater density. California, ought to do this not only for the kind of economic reasons that I sort of just outlined, but it'll also be necessary to do something like this if California is to have any chance of meeting its climate goals, right? Because we're sort of because of our dependency on automobile-based mobility, we're sort of nowhere close to being on track to hit those on current trends. Anyway, that bill is currently pending. Even if passed, I don't think that that's kind of close to being sufficient to solve the kinds of issues we're talking about. But I mean, I guess the kind of broader point I'd make, and I'll shut up on this topic then, but is that I think we rightly think about housing as just a very kind of basic economic efficiency matter, quality of life issue, and that if 40-50% of your income is kind of being expropriated by incumbent owners of capital, that's not kind of optimal sort of social utility. But I think furthermore, we should think of it as an issue of just kind of fundamental economic justice. Again, we're sort of preventing the rest of the country and indeed the rest of the world from benefiting from the opportunities that people here are likely to have had access to. And then secondly, I think we should think of it as a matter of innovation. These days we're talking a lot about sort of how does the U.S. make sure we keep up with China, or how do we retain our preeminence and all the rest. It seems a little bit prosaic and humdrum to think about a kind of housing policy in that context. But I think the linkage is very clear. Where I think the easiest way for the U.S. to improve its kind of its productivity, to retain its technological preeminence, is to ensure the area, i.e. here, that's already working, is capable of ingesting the future generations of talent that will be required if we're to keep it so.
Great. I mean, I would say very much for Stanford, one of the biggest issues for us is affordability. There's multiple long-range planning committees in Stanford right now, and one of the most heated and focused has been on affordability and housing. I want to switch to ask about another policy topic, which again, in fact, is going to be discussed in more detail this afternoon, which is kind of vexed economists, which is on concentration and profitability of high tech. So there's been concerns that high tech, I guess, particularly Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google are seeing incredibly high market shares. There's threats. I'm not sure most people are on board, but with kind of some antitrust activity. Yes. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, economy-wide, we're seeing increasing dispersion in the productivity of firms, right? And so, and not just in technology. And this is an interesting phenomenon, right? Because well, actually, really, I should just I think Nick did not ask this question with this intent, but really, this is basically a plug for Nick's research. I'm going to turn it into a plug for Nick's research. Nick works on analyzing and sort of trying to understand the effects of management, right? And sort of, historically, we focus on these very coarse inputs into companies, capital and labor and all the rest. But there's obviously kind of all these subtle questions about like how do companies actually mix these inputs together and kind of what goes on beneath the surface. And you might have an intuition that sort of with the world becoming more complicated and technology affording more possibilities and all the rest, that how you mix these inputs together is becoming more important. And sure enough, that is what kind of appears to be showing up in the data. And again, sort of given the sort of same inputs, again, the sort of dispersion of productivity across firms, the efficacy with which they combine these inputs, the variance there does seem to be increasing. Furthermore, there's all this other, and a lot of people here will be familiar with it, so I won't kind of bore with reprising it, but the stuff like the sort of growing fraction of firm market cap that is accounted for, not by the factory and the cash on hand and all the rest, but by sort of intangible assets, where well, the firm is very valuable, but it's not really clear where exactly is that value coming from. And again, kind of upon deeper investigation, a lot of it does appear to be some combination of particular characteristics of the human capital, but also their kind of expertise and efficacy in putting that to work. Another, and again, I promise none of this was rehearsed in advance, but another super important thought-provoking paper from the last 10 years was also one of Nick's, and you can characterize it better than I can, but you might sort of see differences between firms, and one of them is doing better than the other, and that appears to be because the sort of superior management of one firm versus another. But you might wonder, well, how much does the management actually matter? Like, it could be the case, for example, among two different companies that the company that has an intrinsically better business model can afford, because of its greater profits, to just hire better people, right? And so they have better people. Those people kind of do a better, kabuki dance called management. But it's not at root the better management that's driving the improvement. It's just some intrinsic kind of structural superiority in the underlying business model. And so Nick and co were part of this randomized trial in India, where you take a basket of firms, you teach half of them better management techniques, and you I guess withhold it from the other half, and try to make sure they don't Google too much HBR and all the rest. And you see what happens. Is teaching management and our improvements on kind of management quality scores actually improving the outcome of the firms? And well, what was the outcome? The percentage in 3-year problem?
Well, I'm going to stop you embarrassing me anymore. I'm going to say I would love to. I'd also love to get questions from the audience.
Great. Well,
do you have any quick?
Sure.
But before I turn to, do you have any? What are your thoughts generally on? Do you think high tech has become too concentrated?
I mean, no, I guess. And so, if you just look at it empirically, a kind of market cap concentration in the technology sector over the last kind of 40 or 50 years, we're not at historical highs. And so I know maybe qualitatively, we talk more about Amazon or Google or whatever more kind of now than it feels like we did 5 or 10 years ago. But if you just look at it on a sectoral basis, is the technology sector more concentrated than it has been in the past? Obviously it fluctuates a bit. There's reasonable amount of variance there, but we're not at any kind of particularly anomalous point. And so markups don't appear to be, there's been some controversy as to kind of whether markups, this is more economy-wide than in the tech sector, but it's kind of whether markups are increasing. Trainin had a good paper, I guess this time last year, showing how that doesn't appear to be the case. And so there's kind of some mixed evidence there, but I would say, generally speaking, the case for kind of concentration tends to be much more qualitative than one that I think is really robustly quantitatively founded, but I'm not an expert here.
I have to say I agree, but there's experts talking this afternoon, so I don't want to prejudge, but it's certainly a very lively topic, and I think it's very related to threats of antitrust. So how about I take some questions from the audience? Does anyone have any questions for Patrick? Yep, over there, thanks.
I'd like to go back to the beginning of your talk about filtering and signaling in higher education. Because in the old model, higher education was about human capital enhancement. People went to college to learn stuff, and that generally made them more valuable for the society as a whole. And this ties in a bit with the internet in the sense that one could ask, well, what do you learn at Stanford that you couldn't learn on screen? And there seems to be a developing consensus or prejudice in some quarters that, well, the difference is you could learn calculus on screen, and maybe the entire California community college system only needs one calculus. But it's the people you meet. It's the networks you form. And Harvard, for example, has networking nights for the undergraduates now. And there's actually been some complaining about this among the undergraduates. It's destroying friendship structure at Harvard and that kind of thing. But I just, in terms of policy, if that Kaplan book is it Kaplan, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Is kind of overstated, as you said. And he makes a point that not all about signaling.
For sure.
But just take a simplified model and say it is all about that, okay? And then there's this network. Why would that be valuable to people who go to a place like Stanford or Harvard? Well, it's networking. Okay, well, the problem or the policy mushroom that comes out of that, in my mind, is, well, then why the hell does society subsidize this? Because if the point is it's valuable to me to go, not because I contribute more to society, but because my private network allows me to scarf up more of the general wealth.
If college has simply distributional effect rather than kind of aggregate human
And
capital
even worse,
elevation.
I mean, the track record of insider private networks is not always sinister, but it certainly is a lot more complicated than any notion of, well, let's train people in biology and then we'll get medical progress. You know, we won't know exactly where it is, but it'll be out there somewhere. So, you know, here's your tax exempt status, higher education. But if it's really not about that, if it's about people forming private networks and signaling to each other and all that, well, then why not just treat it like a business? And isn't, in fact, the rhetoric of higher education, you used it yourself, the product that these places produce, right, is collapsing into a commercial model?
I think you're going to get us kicked out. But yeah, I mean, I didn't even touch on it, but like, just if you haven't, go look into the, as you touch on here, some of the loan burden statistics, and it's I mean, actually, an open question for me is it as bad as it looks, or is the data somehow overstated? Because the raw facts of the aggregate student loan burden across the US are insane. And it makes the housing crisis look paltry by comparison.
So any other ideally one that's not quite as negative about Stanford, but if you want, you can pile it on. Yes, here's a question over here.
Hi, you've talked eloquently about the housing crisis here. There's also an issue with regard to homelessness in San Francisco, and you were very vocally active about Prop C. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about Prop C, its impact on Stripe, how you think about it as it relates to homelessness in San Francisco.
Sure. So Prop C was a ballot prop measure in San Francisco that sort of created a new tax to subsidize some further homeless services. We were opposed to it because we think that, I mean, now that it passed and looks likely to be implemented, I guess we'll see here. We didn't think it would solve the problem, and that kind of ad root. If you just look at what that successful homeless policies across different cities, Salt Lake City has done a particularly good job of this here in the U.S. They're housing first. I mean, this is fundamentally a problem of supply. Prop C will not create enough supply, and as you can hear, we're kind of very militant on thinking that significant supply expansion is what's going to be required. Not just for homelessness, but sort of more broadly to get to the point that we need to. And so, I think it's an inadequate policy response. And furthermore, I think, and I really don't want to bore people with the kind of arcane details here, but it's a very kind of specific. Like, it's not just a kind of homeless measure, but it is a very specific plan with lots of specific policy details. We think in aggregate that that's just sort of not the right plan, and it's obviously not just us saying it. It was also the mayor of San Francisco and many others. And so we think homelessness is super important. This plan is not going to fix the problem. We need to do better, and I really hope we can.
Great. I think we've got time for one more quick question.
I was very interested in what you were saying about the, and without drawing a false dichotomy, with what you were saying about underlying models or management in business. So for Stripe, which one is it?
Sorry. Yes.
I think it is.
Which?
Well-managed enterprise.
Yes.
Or great underlying business.
Oh, I see.
Time actually. Another 30 seconds. So.
All right. I think. Well, I think it's sort of. Ideally, I mean, of course, it would be great underlying business in the sense that, you know, Warren Buffett talks about how you, he seeks to invest in businesses that could be run by a ham sandwich because you know, if you have a business that requires some sort of super genius running it sort of persistently, you know, that's a fragile state, right? And you want something that can kind of really succeed in the merits. In Stripe's particular case, I mean, we weren't obviously the first online payments company. You know, we weren't even the 100th, right? There was this kind of super crowded space around us when we commenced. And I think that, and so therefore, I think there's some kind of suggestive evidence, perhaps, that it's not the intrinsic business, because then our antecedents, you know, would be more successful than they were. But I guess, yeah, to the previous point, I actually, so that would maybe seem to suggest that it's kind of management, although I want to emphasize that management means really the aggregate actions of everyone in the firm. I don't want to claim anything for kind of me myself, but yes, to the Buffett point, that's, you know, perhaps bad news. You know, if we were really sort of trying to at least maximize the sort of long-term equity value of the business, we should be trying to have, you know, our own management facility, in as much as it exists, become less important. Oh, wait, ask the employees first.
Okay, fantastic. That was really great. We should thank Patrick again for coming.
Thank you, Nick.